Well, hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Wright County Restoration Project podcast. Had a good time last week. Had a nice Thanksgiving in between. Sam, how was yours?
It was very good, very good. Got to interact with some neighbors, and it was a blessing. So it was a good Thanksgiving.
Excellent, and mine was as well. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to have it. Well, this week we're going to be going in we're going to point ourselves in a trajectory this week, and the trajectory is going to be working toward the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and hopefully get there next week. We'll just have to see how time goes and whatnot, but we're going to lay a little bit of a foundation this week, and that foundation is going to center around something that I think is really important, which is the nature of the foundational biblical nature of the founding. We think of the Declaration of Independence and this idea that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable or unalienable, depending on who you ask, rights. Apparently both are accepted. And the way I'd like to do this today is by contrasting between the nature of the American Revolution and that of the French Revolution. And to lay a little bit of a foundation for this, we know that within, perhaps our listeners do or don't know, that within the scope of the French Revolution, there was a strong de-Christianization effort. Yeah. And a lot of this had to do with the Catholic Church and its corruption, as well as with this new way of thinking around the French Enlightenment and having particularly to do with reason. Right. And what I'd like to do first is give a little bit of a summary of what's called the Humanist Manifesto. This was penned in 1933. This is one of 3 Humanist Manifestos. They do them every 40 years. So they had the first one in 1933, the second in 1973, and then the third one was in 2003. So I guess there was only 30 years for that one. So 40 years first, then 30 years. And these Humanist Manifestos are a document speaking to a unique change, the unique change that has been taking place in society and culture with the digital revolution and prior to that, the Industrial Revolution and the world wars and such, right. And speaking to the call for something new. And what these men saw was that they believed that man was going to be able to chart his own destiny. And because he could chart his own destiny, the nature of religion as we know it was becoming archaic and insufficient. So I'm going to read a little bit of what I'd like to do is read some of the introduction to this. And then hopefully over the next couple of weeks, particularly as we get to the Bill of Rights, we'll look through various points among these 15 points of the first Humanist Manifesto, and we'll kind of see where they fit in contrast, where right. the Bill of Rights specifically contrasts with what humanism teaches. And then, of course, we'll try to link it today with how very humanistic the French Revolution was. Yep. And perhaps that's why it only lasted, the Republic there, the first one, only lasted a few years, and then gave way to Napoleon Bonaparte.
Right, a strongman rule. Right,
a strongman who took over to bring back a measure of order in the chaos. Yeah. So the introduction says this, and I'm going to skip around a little bit here. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions of the world over are under a necessity of coming to terms with new conditions created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience. In every field of human activity, the vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism. Skipping a little bit, there is great danger, of a final and we believe fatal identification of the word religion with doctrines and methods which have lost their significance and which are powerless to solve the problem of human living in the 20th century. Religions have always been means for realizing the highest values of life. Their end has been accomplished through the interpretation of the total environing situation, theology or worldview, the sense of values resulting therefrom, goals or ideals, and the technique, they call this the cult, established for realizing the satisfactory life. A change in any of these factors results in alteration of the outward forms of religion. Skipping a little bit again. Today, man's larger understanding of the universe, his scientific achievements, and deeper appreciation of brotherhood have created a situation which requires a new statement of the means and purposes of religion. While this age does owe a vast debt to the traditional religions, it is nonetheless obvious that any religion that can hope to be a synthesizing and dynamic force today must be shaped for the needs of this age. And so what these men recognized, and I key in on that word cult, because that's
Right.
what the French did, is they erected within the scope of, really it was during the Reign of Terror, that they erected this cult of reason.
Right.
Whereby they tried to completely remove all biblical Christianity, including Catholicism, which had strayed far from biblical Christianity by
Right.
that time, and tried to remove all elements of that religion and instead bring a new cult, a new religious system that was secular in scope. And it's interesting to me here that humanism is spoken of as religious humanism, that they recognize that there is still a cult aspect to it,
Right.
that they're simply replacing one religious system with another religious system, dethroning the God of the Bible and instead enthroning humanity,
Right.
believing that humanity had somehow changed enough to where we have, or would, as we'd see, evolved past the petty bickering, the wars, the need for the central tenets of private property and of personal gain, and moving toward a unified, what they would call in the 14th point, a humanism that is free and universal, or a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. And this is the same thing we're seeing today, right?
Right.
This is the attack on the Constitution and Bill of Rights, is that it has this unique perspective that's rooted in the Bible, private property, the worth of every individual,
Yep. Human life.
worth of human life, natural human dignity, over necessarily these other elements of broader society and direction.
Yeah.
So we have this layout for the Humanist Manifesto. Talk to me a little bit about the nature of the French Revolution and why it is you think the French Revolution failed where the American Revolution, and perhaps we shouldn't even give them the same name because they were very, very different.
Absolutely.
But where the American Revolution, we might say, succeeded.
Yeah, I think it's good to even note, the term revolution is, they were both very different. I mean, there were similarities in that both were rebelling against a king figure who was oppressing the people without their consent, though the people really never had the same kind of consent system as the Englishmen,
Right.
who came up with the Declaration of Independence, basically saying, King George, we're Englishmen, treat us as such.
Yeah.
And that was not respected. So that's part of the, is why, early on in the first early battles of the Revolutionary War, they were still seeing themselves as Englishmen,
Yep.
just trying to get the attention of King George at that point. It's interesting, and it comes down to a lot of the foundation of how societies are built, or what societies are built on, in the seeing what is the difference, because also in the once the smoke had cleared to some extent, or even before with the French Revolution, there were some of the founders like Thomas Jefferson that were involved from a distance in the French Revolution, trying to impart, and they were even trying to use some of the same documents that we had found helpful in founding, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Other things were being brought over, and it was why didn't they work? I mean, that's the question you ask. Why would it work in America, and why wouldn't it work? Aren't people the same? What's the reasoning? And I think to answer that question, I think it's really interesting. I'm going to read a little bit from a history book that I found really interesting. This was written. It's out of a series, but it's written by a gentleman that wanted to put together a really good history for the children of our country, and he wrote these around the 1880s. He was
Introduce it a little bit more so that our listeners
Sure, absolutely.
can
So
know
this
where
this
you're
book
getting
that I'm going to
from.
be reading on is called Building a Nation. It's written by Charles Carlton Coffin. If you're a history buff or somebody who wants to study a little bit more about history, I would highly recommend write that name down, Charles Carlton Coffin, and look him up. He has a lot of really good books. And wrote around the 1880s, was also a correspondent for the Boston Journal during the American Civil War, and had ancestors in the Revolutionary War, and passed down a lot of this information to him. So it's a lot of first-hand, second-hand information, but very much well laid out information, and before a lot of these humanist ideas and other things came into play. So I think it was, the older you go with history and the closer to the actual events, and first-hand accounts, of course, are really good, but you're going to get more of a pure history, and you're going to get more of a perspective of what people at that time thought.
Sure.
And so the part I'd like to read, and he has a couple chapters here on the French Revolution, but this is how he ends this chapter on the French Revolution, and going through the causes and everything that brought the French people to ultimately want to throw off all forms of government restraint, whether that be the lords and owners that basically controlled their everyday life, whether it was the king who kind of controlled everything, and the church, which controlled a vast amount of property. It's estimated that the church owned about a third of the land in France at this time of the French Revolution, and was also heavily, the people had to pay the church a good size amount of their income, as well as the king and the lords and the people that were over them. So all that said, here's what he wrote, and I'll speak to it once I get through it, but I think it's interesting because it ties in with the Pilgrims. And this is something that, if you listen to the last episode, it's kind of a little tie between these two. So here's what Charles Carlton Coffin wrote regarding the reasons and the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The Pilgrims of the Mayflower elected William Bradford, governor, and William Brewster to be their minister. They built the schoolhouse and the meeting house side by side to educate themselves for the present and the future life. Out of that exercise of natural right in electing their rulers and educating themselves came the Republic of the United States. France had no schools, or at least, as he's saying here, no free schools, no schools for the common person to go to. There were plenty of churches, but through the corruption and despotism of the church, there had been a dying out of virtue, morality, and religion. Men believed in nothing. That's what we're going to see with the humanism that fills that void. The strongest ruled, and the enduring republic under such conditions was not possible. Out of the revolution came the one man who could restore order, Napoleon Bonaparte. So that's, in a nutshell, we see that it really comes down to having not just an educated populace, but an educated populace in the Judeo-Christian values, seeing value in the church and in study of the Bible,
right,
in seeing value in self-government,
yep,
in as the Pilgrims do, and then future settlers, and as the states begin to form, they're setting up their own government. It is a representative government. That is what begins to be encroached upon. That brings upon those people. The American Revolution is them governing themselves and then the English government coming in and starting to strip away some of that self-government. A lot of us, no taxation without representation. It's wanting to, it's okay to be taxed to an extent, but you
need to see
have
the
a
benefits.
say in it, and you need to see the benefits.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then it's up to each person how that would go. So that's that was something that they saw. But I think that, to me, sums it up very well, is that you're looking at two completely different societies in the basis of the morality that they had and the understanding of just the foundation of what society is built on.
So we connect this to the Pilgrims, and we recognize that, as you talked about last week, the Pilgrims had a unique experience, the Separatists, right, where they went from England to Holland, and there they felt like fish out of water. They had to work very, very hard. Their bodies were breaking down, but also they were out of touch with the society as it related to culture, and they were losing their children to it, and they came to the New World as a means by which to actually take the responsibility upon themselves. They wanted that responsibility. They wanted the responsibility of educating their children. They wanted the responsibility of governing themselves. Whereas when we look at what happened in France, that's not how their revolution went. These people, they were there, they were entrenched, and they wanted what was theirs, right? They were already in the land. The church was fleecing them. The king was fleecing them. And now what they wanted was to get theirs, to have what others had. And so there is a very different spirit, really, between the foundation of the New World in the United States, which was a spirit of self-reliance and a desire to align oneself with these principles of self-governance, of self-education, of self-responsibility, and the spirit of the French Revolution, which was kind of a demonizing of the rich, a demonizing of the powerful, and a desire to throw off their former rulers in order for fairness to reign. And just to give a little more context, Napoleon came to power in 1799, and it was in 1789 that the revolution really kicked in. So we saw a brief 10-year period there, and it was punctuated by the Reign of Terror, which was a brief period of time where something like 16,000 people had their heads chopped off in the name of the injustices that they had done. The wealthy, the aristocrats, Louis XVI himself was executed, and so we see it more like a backlash than really what the American Revolution was, which was the end of a long chain of petitions, and then a recognition, as the Declaration would say, of a long train of abuses that culminated in having to sever the ties that bound them. And of course, the Declaration itself stating how hesitant they all were to sever those ties, and a very, very different idea all around. So we think of the Catholic Church, which had this domination in France until that time, but they had become somewhat, I don't know if the word we'd want to use is lazy. They had become entrenched, they had become entitled, they owned a lot of land, they got this tithe, and then the Reign of Terror took it all away and established instead this cult of reason, a de-Christianization of the land. And if we go back to this Humanistic Manifesto for a moment, the first several tenets have to do with this idea. So the first tenet of the Humanist Manifesto is humanism believes that religious humanists regard no universe. Let's try this again, and I'll try reading properly. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. So the first thing that the humanist does is cast off a creator. In casting off a creator, we cast off accountability, but we also cast off something very, very important, and that very important thing is we cast off intrinsic value. That value is now, as you read from Coffin, rooted in strength. It's rooted in that which can dominate. And we think of this as it relates to evolution. The second point in the Humanist Manifesto is humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. So then the humanist says man is a part of nature. Man has emerged as a result of a cold and unfeeling process of science and of time. And in doing so, I have no intrinsic value, and the only value I have is the value that I have, the weak being dominated and the strong prevailing.
Right.
This is the idea of survival of the fittest. And then the third point here, holding an organic view of life, humanists find that the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected. In other words, no spirit. That man is not spiritual, he is not eternal, he is temporal, and he is material. So we set a groundwork within that idea, a revolutionary groundwork that is conducive to destruction of human life,
Right.
and conducive to abuses of powerful men. Whereas if we think of the Declaration of Independence, recognizing that man is endowed by their creator, now we have a higher law unto which the pilgrims and
Right.
unto which this new world was called unto.
Yes.
They were not submitting themselves to the philosophies, even as we think of the various interactions that Thomas Jefferson would have with the French revolutionaries. They send over these documents, and in the mind of the American, or the American-to-be, these documents are intended to rein men into a higher power.
Right.
Whereas in France, it seemed as though their attempt was to create a shift in power from certain men and certain institutions, that being the Catholic Church and the monarchy,
Right.
to different institutions, institutions that would attempt to be more fraternal, as they would use, égalité, liberté, fraternité, but simultaneously still man-centered.
Right.
That's interesting. Any other thoughts on the French Revolution versus the American Revolution, and kind of how those contrasted, or
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think it's very interesting. I mean, when you dig into it, and if you really want to do some deep study on just the vast difference between France and Europe in general, the idea of the aristocracy, the way even wealth and things were handled, and how these big moneyed families just kept, these big aristocracy families just kept all the wealth, and just kind of the interesting thing, and then what an amazing different country the United States was, how different this idea was. An interesting book, though. Also, there's your big thick book of the week. Hard to read through, but Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville is an interesting read. If you can find it on an audiobook, it's a good listen through. But it's a gentleman who, right around the time of the French Revolution, tours, and he's a French gentleman, and he tours the United States, or what is the United States and the frontier at that time, and really brings contrast between both sides, which I think is an interesting study, but something that, and I've studied parts of it, but not with the thoughts about the humanist idea coming in, and I think I'm going to have to look at it again and kind of see if I can draw more from that, because I think, one thing that stuck out to me was his just speaking about how fluid money is in the Americas, where in France and most of Europe they had the law of entail, where the oldest son gets pretty much everything, gets the entire land in an estate, and the younger brothers go off to seek their fortune in the military, or go to America and try to make your fortune, or whatever, that kind of thing. But it was and thus these huge castles and villas and money and servants and land just keep rolling from one generation to another, where and he sees it, at least the way he lays it out in his writings, is just kind of atrocious that Americans would, that a father could, through good business practices and everything else, amass a decent fortune, and then it get just kind of willy-nilly put out to all the children, and then maybe they blow it, maybe they keep it, and it just, the flow of monies was something that stuck out to him. But I think, those kind of things are interesting, but I think it is good to look very carefully at just how the foundation of the culture, how the foundation of the society really did play into. I mean, there's a lot of different things that go on just in tradition of different areas, but when it does come down to it, the founders were very keen on having, in the early forms of public education, which today is a far cry from what they had back then, and oftentimes it was very closely attached, and sometimes it was the exact same building, sometimes the exact same teaching staff as the church.
Right.
That those were very close. We're not really talking about a church school. We're talking about, it's the meeting house where all the community comes to, and during the week, children of all ages go there. They get an education in the Bible. They get an education in basic letters and some basic mathematics, and basically whoever was
reading, writing, arithmetic, right?
Right,
the
right.
3 R's.
The super basics. But it was a very, if you look at some of the early Websters and the blueback spellers and other things, the way you're learning your alphabets is through Bible stories for each letter.
Right.
A is for Adam, and you work your way down, and that is what is grounding these young people that are growing up through generations up until the Revolutionary War and after. And so you wind up with a population that has a very strong grounding in the Bible, in Judeo-Christian principles, and in the morality of that. And that
natural human dignity, private property, work ethic, all of those things that we think about with the Puritan system.
Right. And that's really key to having the American experiment work, as it were. Being a historian, you hear a lot of different quotes, and I don't remember who exactly said it, but I know that there was a quote, man will be either controlled by the Bible or the bayonet. And I can't remember if it was Jefferson or somebody who said that, but that kind
We'll find it.
We'll find it, and we'll say it next week. But that was something that, it's man will either be self-controlled by the Word of God and
by an intrinsic, inherent moral grounding.
Right. Or it's the strongest man rules. It's
Right.
It's as you said in there. It's the survival of the fittest. It's the biggest guy with the biggest stick, and he's the one that can extract the wealth from the weak or destroy the weak if they're of no use to him.
Yep. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, and I'll put this on the quotes that we may be misquoting type idea. But was it de Tocqueville who had that famous quote, "America is great because America is good. If America ceases to be good, America will cease to be great."
I believe that was.
I thought that was de Tocqueville. We'll double check on that one too and make sure that we're not misinforming you here. But perhaps as we finish today, we built this whole thing on kind of this contrast and the Humanist Manifesto and the nature of humanism and the nature of these different cultures. And we recognize the fundamentally different way of thinking in the Americas, in the New World, as opposed to Europe. But we need to also remember in this, the Humanist Manifesto says that there needs to be a new religion, a new cult fitted for a new century, a new time, the Industrial Revolution, where knowledge is increasing, where people have figured out all of these things. And we have very much that same sentiment today, that we have changed so much. And I mean, in some ways, I think that optimism was a bit doused by World War I and World War II, as people thought in the late 1800s that we were in a post-war world, and everything was just heading upward into through modernism, and then that post-war world comes crashing down with the worst wars that we had seen in generations.
Right.
But it's an important reminder from the Bible as we close today, as we again see the optimism that science can solve all of our problems, and that we're digging to the root of human existence, to where we can transcend to become something more than we are. But, the Bible says this, and this was something that the founders understood. This is something that the American philosophy understood through their education and such. In Romans chapter 3, verse 10, the Bible is quoting here, and it's going to quote from several of the Psalms, in fact. And Paul writes this. He says, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps, a type of snake, is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." So Paul links here all of these negative virtues, the things that we really saw come out of the reign of terror in the Revolution, as their attempt to establish the French Republic. We see all of those things, Paul connecting them to there is no fear of God before their eyes.
Absolutely.
And so whereas humans keep getting this idea in their mind that they can get there on their own, that politics can save us, that even morality or some other cult of religion can save us, that simply having something in place can save us, what we seem to see is that when man casts off God, there's only one inevitable end, and that inevitable end is this kind of chaos, this kind of evil, because while we can change our environments, and again, we'll talk more about this as we get through more of the Humanist Manifesto, we can change our environment, we can change these things, but at the end of the day, we're still human, and humans have this intrinsic bent toward corruption and evil. Hence, as we can read in the Declaration of Independence, then the Federalist Papers bringing about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, hence this unique structure within our government of gridlock, this separation of powers, this system that is put in place specifically to bring checks and balances into the system, to limit the government, to limit power, to limit authority, specifically to limit human nature, and to bind human nature to a set of fearful expectations that if men try to take power, people have the right and the ability to bind them and then eventually cast them off if need be.
Right.
So we come back to this idea, and it's an important one that's going to overshadow everything that we talk about from week to week, and that is this reality that we are created, that there is an authority that is higher than us. And until we can come back to, as a society, as in Wright County, this restoration idea, a big part of the restoration idea is a understanding of truth and accountability and authority that goes beyond just each other.
Right.
It goes beyond just our political leaders or our church leaders or whatever it might be, and really rests itself with fundamental principles of God, of a authoritative creator God, who holds the power, who has expectations, and under whose expectations we operate regardless of who's watching or regardless of who we can and cannot take advantage of. We know that there's accountability. Okay, well then we will stop on that for this week. Thank you all for joining us again. We tried to keep it a little shorter this time. If you have any feedback, we'll put a link in the description to our email addresses. You can get a hold of us. Let us know if you have feedback. And we would love to hear from you, hear how things are going. Did you like it a bit longer? Do you like it a bit shorter? Maybe this fits into your ride to work a little bit easier, whatever it might be. If you have any questions on this point in history, I know we assumed a lot. We assumed a lot on your knowledge of history. Tried to give you just a little bit of context there, but we're going to get a little more slow and deliberate next week, and we'll try to work through those things. But if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, links are in the description. Let us know. And if you're listening on podcast,
you can find it on YouTube and then find our info.
There you go. Find us on YouTube. Get our info that way. Wright County Restoration Project. Get our info. Maybe we'll work on that. We'll have some sort of intro or exit that can give them some information in the future.
For sure.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Wright County Restoration Project.